Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Today we're exploring the stories and insights and challenges facing university leaders. Today we're joined by two very transformative leaders who are very involved in today's landscape of higher education and college athletics. First, my guest is President Geoffrey S. Mearns, the 17th president of Ball State University. Since 2017, he's led initiatives like this Destination 2040, Our Flight Path, driving record-breaking enrollment, alumni engagement, and fundraising while shaping the university's long-term vision. Geoffrey, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be with you, Karen. Thank you for the opportunity.
Glad to have you. And joining him today is Dr. John Steinbrecher, Commissioner of the Mid-American Conference since 2009, which in and of itself is quite amazing. With a historic career spanning leadership at all three NCAA Division I Subdivisions, John has elevated college athletics and championed the student-athlete experience. John, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be with you, Karen.
So we're going to start today with your letter that you wrote last week. That's what got me sitting up and thinking about how both you, John, and the Conference Council of Presidents got together and decided that this is something we need to communicate to other presidents, other trustees, the NCAA membership, student athletes, coaches, all those kinds of things. So walk us through, John, how did that happen?
A lot of letters, as it turns out, and most of them stay in my desk drawer. And this has been, for me, an issue that's been bubbling for some time. I mean, we could even go back over a year probably, but as you look at the landscape of college athletics, I just think the behavior we've seen on the field from the participants, whether it's student athletes or coaches, and I would also include fans in that, has continued to, let's just say, deteriorate. And then we had a weekend ago. Well, let's go back in the past month. We had the start of basketball season. We've had notable sideline antics by coaches, post-game antics by coaches and players. And then, some of the things going on post-game at some football games and things like that. At some point, enough is enough. And what I will link this to a couple of things. For year after year after year, the focus of intercollegiate athletics was on the educational outcomes of the student athletes, largely because of judicial intervention. We are now at a time when we're very focused, the general public, the media, state and federal legislatures, et cetera, on the short-term economic opportunities for student athletes. And for many, it's a very short-term and probably minimal economic opportunity. And we've forgotten about the educational end of it. If we're going to have intercollegiate athletics existing within higher education, being linked to the academy, then we have an obligation to be focused on our values and our ethics. And part of that is how we play the game. It's trite to say, but how we play the game is important. How one wins, how one loses. It's part of the educational experience. We haven't been doing a very good job of reinforcing what some of those expectations should be.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the behavior, just in case my listeners aren't aware. What were some of the things, John, you observed in the last month or so?
Coaches on sidelines being incredibly violent and threatening, using language that would if they would talk to a student in a classroom, a fellow faculty member that way, they'd probably be fired. Yet somehow we tolerate it on the field of competition, increasing levels of taunting by the participants. And then I think everybody was focused a week or two ago. One weekend, we had a lot of people planting the flag. We were playing capture the flag, apparently. So a lot of people trying to plant flags on other people's fields. And so just an array of things such as that.
Yeah. And those things, the planting of the flag typically happens at the end of the game when teams are trying to disperse, when fans are starting to go home, and it becomes a very uncertain kind of time for teams to kind of navigate.
Instead of coming together after the game, congratulating the victors or whatever you do, and then getting the heck off the field, you end up with all sorts of things going on the field. And then add into that, in some cases, where we have fans storming the field. That adds another layer of stress. And people who weren't involved directly in the competition now out there, in some cases, just being joyous, in some cases, being very confrontational in what is already a high stress situation. And so it makes that situation less and less safe for all involved.
Yeah. And Jeffrey, you're on the board, obviously, of the MAC conference, but you also lead a institution. What kinds of thoughts go through your head when you see events like this?
Well, so I'll go back to what John said. Many of us believe in the value of collegiate sports, of intercollegiate athletics, and we believe it's part of the development of the women and men who compete in college sports. We believe that the preparation for the competition is about personal development, about leadership development. And as John suggested, if we cannot continue to demonstrate the positive educational value of college sports, what justification can we offer for continuing to maintain intercollegiate sports, irrespective of whether it's at the highest level of FBS football or whether it's all the way down to Division III or NAIA? If we can't demonstrate that we're about our values, about character development, about the educational experience, then we've lost any moral standing to continue to have intercollegiate athletics tethered to an institution of higher education. That relationship is under great strain right now, and it has been for at least a decade. And as John said, it's manifested in state laws around NIL, it's manifested in litigation that we have not prevailed in, we in the NCAA or in colleges. And so I fully support John's commitment that we have to emphasize and preserve those values around character, winning with class, losing with poise, competing respectfully with each other. Then, at that point, we might as well give it up.
Well, let me just dive into your letter a little bit more. There was 5 areas that you talked about, John, in your letter. And again, this was written to Charlie Baker, the president of the NCAA. You talked about sportsmanship and unacceptable behavior. You talked about ethics and integrity, which I think is a huge part of this whole discussion. The need for reaffirming your expectations as university leaders, the cultural issues we're facing right now in society that are impacting and infiltrating athletics, and I would add social media to that, and the urgency for addressing ethical conduct. John, walk us through what kinds of recommendations might you have for college presidents and trustees who oversee this?
It starts with, this isn't about drafting new rules. It's about establishing expectations. And I really start with the expectations start at the institutional level. Boards and presidents ought to be saying to their athletics departments, this is what we expect. This is how we intend to play the game. When I sit down with new presidents, I talk to them that once a year, once a semester, they ought to be in with their coaches and talking to them exactly what their expectations are. Winning is important. We keep the score. If you're playing at this level, that's a big part of it. But how we win is important. How you conduct your program. Do you run it in accordance to the rules? Are you reinforcing behaviors that elevate and help the student athletes to grow? And so it starts there. And then are they willing to, in fact, step up and sanction or call out when those things aren't occurring? When they don't, then our conferences probably jump in at that time. I can tell you in our league, and it's probably not in every case, I have a number of presidents who have no problem stepping up in those areas. But I don't know if that's unique or not. But I think it starts at the institutional level. Then we have responsibility at the conference level. And then we have a responsibility at the national level to help us grow and engage in that conversation and set expectations all the way down. Presidents, why aren't you doing these things? ADs, why aren't you doing these things? Conference commissioners, why aren't you doing these things? Because we all have an effect on each other. When someone else in the pipeline isn't doing something, it puts stress on everybody else. When we have leaders step up, hopefully that reinforces it, because what the kids see on TV, the next group's going to do, right? So we need to be cognizant of that.
Jeffrey, on your campus, I don't know, I'm not aware of any incidents like what happened between Michigan and Ohio State, for example, a couple of weeks ago. But, how would you handle it if something like that broke out in one of your football games or basketball games, other events? What kinds of steps would you take or you might advise presidents to take in that situation?
Well, so first of all, I'd go reiterate and emphasize what John said is whenever I speak to our coaches or whenever I talk publicly about college sports, which I'm passionate about, I was a student athlete. My father was a student athlete. He gave us the educational opportunities we had. So I really value the enterprise. I talk about the three expectations: competitive excellence, academic excellence, and how they represent us with character and integrity on campus, in the community, and when they travel. So I speak to our coaches regularly. In fact, just a few days ago, we hired a new coach of our football team. We play FBS football in the MAC. And at the program where we introduced our new coach to the campus community, I allowed the athletic director to emphasize the criteria that he used around coaching experience and competitive excellence. But I shared with the people who were gathered that in my interview of this candidate, I focused on why did he get into coaching in college sports? I wanted to understand his motivation, his values, to ensure that they aligned with ours. I wanted to ask him about what he would do if there was an incident like that in the locker room, on the field, or in some other activity. And so I think that begins first with consistently emphasizing why we sponsor and support college sports and what our expectations are. So then if we had an incident like one of those, it would be very clear. I'd be able to say to the athletic director, this should not be a surprise to a coach or our student athletes because we've talked about it regularly. And so I want to hear from you how you intend to address this with a coach. I don't think it would be my responsibility to do that directly, but the athletic directors that I've hired also share our values and expectations. So there's no ambiguity on our campus or in our institution when it comes to these kinds of this kind of conduct.
Why, John, why do you think this is so hard for conferences to deal with? It seems like in some ways people get caught up in the moment of a game, the intensity of the rivalry, the passion of the fans, particularly difficult call from a referee. And it feels like we drift further into just this outrageous kind of behavior. What are your thoughts about that?
We see more and more, to use your words, outrageous behavior just in general life now, right? I mean, people are much more confrontational than they were a decade ago. It's just part and parcel of it. There's now we're in an era, particularly in the NIL era, where we have student athletes who very much want to draw attention to themselves, in many cases for very, very good reasons, right? But you're trying to draw people to your social media channels and all sorts of things like that. All of that's going on. You got NIL, just an array of things. And you know what? Stuff is going to happen. Sport is very emotional. It played at the highest level. A lot of investment of time and effort and dreams and all those things. It's going to be emotional. There are going to be challenges from time to time. We just need to be prepared to step up and appropriately correct the situation. And as Jeff had talked about, being consistent with that. And then again, it's not about more rules. It's about having that conversation on a consistent basis with those involved and staying on top of it. It shouldn't be a big surprise. When we have big rivalry games, we spend some time talking about, do we have security set up? What are we doing? I had a football championship game 3 or 4 days ago, which we had one of the biggest rivalries in our league and one of the bigger rivalries in the country, Miami and Ohio, and marvelous competitors on the field and great institutions off the field. And you don't ever know what's going to happen. It's a championship game. Lives change on those types of things. And so we were prepared. Let's be ready just in case. And what was glorious about it is they fought hard on the field. And when the game was over, they came together and congratulated each other. In fact, Jeff sent me a text right after the game about how nice it was to see the teams coming together, shaking hands and celebrating each other. That's what you hope for, but you're prepared for if something maybe goes a little bit awry.
Yeah, yeah. Jeff, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just saying, to me, it often begins, of course, with the university leadership, but it also, the critical intersection is how the coach conducts herself or himself. And so I don't know, again, what transpired in the Michigan-Ohio State game. I don't know what is true, but if what has been widely reported is true, it was disappointing on both sides of the field. My understanding, or what's been reported, is the Michigan players were celebrating and attempting to plant the flag. The head coach of the Michigan football team was reportedly taunting the Ohio State fans standing on the bench.
I
So
heard that.
if that's true, again, I don't know if that's true, but if those reports are accurate, then is it really any surprise that the players acted as they did? And conversely, on the other side of the field, it's been reported that the head coach of Ohio State football didn't go onto the field to address his players as it was happening, didn't engage promptly, and allowed this situation to spiral. So for me, what I would be looking for is how did my head coach react in that instance, in that moment? Because it was telling to me, you can't expect the student athletes to act with class and with poise if the coaches, if the people who are their mentors, their guides, their coaches are not acting in the ways that you would expect.
So before we go to our next topic, what do you want the NCAA to do at this point? Do you want to have a meeting or some kind of discussion at the national convention? Do you want to have a big webinar? What kinds of things do you want to do to try to get other folks on board?
And that's a good question because I don't know that I have one prescription. And I sent the letter to the association because I think they are our association. We ought to work together and work through them. And I've been so impressed with the work Charlie has done on so many issues per se, and then working through our board. What I wanted to do was draw attention to an issue that I don't want it to be brushed aside, because I think for a period of time now, we've tolerated, I'll call it lesser behavior, rather than expecting better. Well, let's have that conversation. And whether it starts at the board of directors and I don't know. I mean, in higher education, we're great at putting committees together, aren't we? I don't know that that's necessarily the answer, but we can't let this go by the wayside, whether it's getting the NCAA council to contemplate it. We've got sportsmanship groups within the association. But again, let's go back and talk about it, what it means to be an intercollegiate athletics program, what our expectations should be individually and collectively, and how do we hold ourselves collectively accountable for those things.
Yeah, yeah.
I think, Karen, I serve on the Division I board of directors. I serve on the Division I administrative committee, in essence, the executive committee. In my view, as John said, we know what's right and we know what the expectations are. This isn't about promulgating a rule or developing, sanctions around expectations. It's about demonstrating leadership at the presidential level, at the commissioner level, the AD level, at the coaches level. The other thing that I would say is we can't lose sight of the fact that in the vast majority of competitions, in the vast majority of sports, the vast majority of institutions, our student athletes conduct themselves with the kind of integrity and expectations. The issue needs to be addressed in those small number of sports at a relatively small number of institutions at Division I, where the cameras are rolling, where millions of people are watching. And I would hope that those of us who sponsor those prominent sports or in positions of leadership will readily agree that the way to address it is to emphasize on our campus what our expectations are and just not to tolerate. We are an association, a membership association, and we should just all step up to those expectations because I know my colleagues all share them. It's just hoping that all of them will have the determination to act upon.
Makes sense. So let's shift gears a little bit. The MAC conference is an outstanding conference. It has the most stable membership of any Division I FBS conference that I know of, and it certainly has a favorable geographic footprint, which allows you to have a lot of great rivalries and hold costs down and that type of things. But I guess what I'd like to do is start with you, Jeff, about the budgets and how fast the budgets are growing, especially in football. I just read today Alabama's football budget is $83 million, which is staggering to me. That the recruiting and retention of athletes is getting more challenging than it's ever been. That the group of five is only guaranteed one automatic college football playoff slot. and the constant undercurrent of getting guarantee versus being left out of the guarantee games, that type of thing. What's your take on this?
Well, I start with how we compete among the MAC. You've identified some of our strengths, consistent membership, a compact geography, homogeneity among the types of institutions. We're all public institutions of similar size. The other way in which we're very similar is our budgets are very similar. There isn't wide disparity. So what we say to AD candidates or head coaching candidates, come to the MAC because you're going to be able to compete on a level playing field within our conference. The other thing, and so the talent of the coaches and the athletes will determine the outcome, not the size of their locker rooms and the amenities that they have in their locker rooms. So, and then we have realistic expectations for where we want to punch above our weight. We're in the process now of having a conversation about how do we leverage those strengths to produce better outcomes in competition and a distinctive student athlete experience where those student athletes will say, maybe notwithstanding the short-term benefit of an NIL contract, I want to get an education and compete at a MAC institution because in the future, people will know that a student athlete who played for and graduated from a MAC institution has those other skills and character and we want to compete across those long-term dimensions, not just how many bowl games we can win. Although, as John knows, I'm one of the most competitive presidents in that room. So that's why we keep score, is to see who will win the game. But I also want to make sure that we keep our lens broadened to all of the reasons why we prepare and play, and also the long-term benefits to the women and men who compete for our institutions.
John?
We are increasingly fragmented, I would say, across Division I. And it's always been that. We've always been a group of conferences, but as the economic pressures have grown, as the need to try and capture, it's very much a zero-sum game. We've seen some of the things that have occurred with various revenue distributions, and it's very much that. And so we are incredibly fragmented. FBS, and now we have the power, whatever, 4 or 5, and the group of 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever it is, and people make determinations based on that instead of necessarily what's going on the field and those sorts of things. That's likely to continue. We're not set up like the NFL or the NBA or whatever. We're a bunch of independent conferences that come together under an association. In some ways, it works tremendously. In some ways, it doesn't work very well at all. And that's the challenge right now. And we'll have to see how this evolves. I mean, very much so. But there is a focus on capturing resources to get back to your member institutions that they can then defray institutional obligations and better support the student athletes they have.
And Karen, if I can add just one thing. It's not just fragmentation between the autonomy and the group of 5 or FBS and FCS. The fragmentation that's also occurring within some of those autonomy conferences is increasingly pronounced. I mean, who would have predicted 2 years ago that the Pac-12 would splinter apart and probably not survive, or certainly not survive in the way we've viewed the Pac-12? Because of the separation within that conference. You mentioned Alabama's football budget. I bet there's some institutions in the SEC who are straining to keep up. Or how does an institution like a Purdue continue to compete in football against Ohio State or Michigan or now Oregon? So there's going to be continued strain on even those conferences that we thought would never dissolve or break apart. So it's going to be, we have to, as John said, continue to talk about and emphasize the things that unite us and not the things that strain our relationships and our commitment to the association.
Yeah. John, one of the things I wanted to ask you, because you talked about trying to find new revenue streams, you might be one of the only college conferences with an agreement with Genius Sports. Is that right? That
is correct.
Can you talk about that a little bit and what's that's meant?
Yeah, we licensed our data, our statistics to them.
Okay.
For them to provide this is the official source for Mid-American Conference statistics and to an array of things, but a very specific grouping of that are sports wagering enterprises. And so instead of for them getting data through other unofficial sources, they could come through Genius and capture our data. We had a long conversation. That was a year worth of conversations. There were some NCAA hoops we needed to jump through. And where we came down is at the end of the day, sports wagering is a state-sanctioned, state-regulated activity. I work for 12 state-sanctioned, state-regulated enterprises, quite frankly. And the sports wagering is going to go on whether I do my data that way or not. I'd rather have them get the official data and let's do it. Let's be part of the solution. Let's be involved in integrity services. Let's be involved in education. Let's be involved in working with our coaches, administrators, student athletes on educational activities so that we're eyes wide open. But that was a new revenue source for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you think it's paid off in the effort it takes to aggregate and send those statistics? Is it something that's been a positive net balance to it?
Yeah, it's essentially taking something and just flipping a switch,
Okay.
quite frankly. And I was doing all these I'm doing the integrity monitoring, I'm doing the educational things, I'm doing all of these other things, whether I'm involved with that or not. It's just what we do today, which is a positive. The upside, I don't need to get into a long discussion on sports wagering and whether it should have a role in intercollegiate athletics or not. It does. It's where it's at right now. The state laws are allowing that. And so we're having to be aggressive in how we provide oversight for it. But because we have state regulated, state sanctioned, we have a much easier job of, easy is probably the wrong word, but a more direct way of monitoring and discovering if there are issues or not. And so we're taking it out of the dark corners and back of somebody's barbershop or bar or wherever you would go on that. And now it's much more sunshine on that. And that should be of help everybody. I don't know, sleep better is the right word, but we're going to detect things if something's occurring.
Interesting.
And
Interesting. Yeah.
Karen, to your earlier kind of question or framing, these kind of topics are ones that we talk about as presidents when
Okay.
John brings these issues. That's why when he said, it was something we had been talking about probably for at least 12 months, because of the questions associated, for example, with even legalized gambling. One of the things that I support and I know is a priority for Charlie Baker right now is to try to persuade states to prohibit prop bets on college sports, where there's more susceptibility to somebody influencing a student athlete. That seems to me a quite reasonable request and approach. It doesn't eliminate sports betting on college sports, but constrains it in a way that starts to minimize the risk associated with it. We also talk about it, for example, it's in the same kind of category when we talk about whether we would want to have the MAC have a beer company be the official sponsor of the MAC. Virtually every institution in the MAC probably is selling beer or wine in their basketball arena or their football stadium. But do we want to go the next step and promote it? We talk about those as to figure out what is still consistent with our values and where is that line as society continues to change in terms of what is considered acceptable.
Well, let me give you another example of trying to bring value back to the institution, because I'm challenged by my presidents to have the Mid-American Conference bring us value outside of athletics. And so one of the things we got into probably 6-7 years ago now is esports. We had one school that was really on the front wave of it. And so we contemplated it as a league. And you look at the kids who are participating in it, they're STEM students, they're really good students. Bunches and bunches and bunches of kids are engaged in this activity. The numbers are staggering. We started an esports league, and all of our schools now participate in that. Some of them, the number of students that are now coming to their schools because of those esports teams, well, we're helping to grow enrollment. That's another way in which we can add value to the enterprise, bring revenue to the institution.
Right. Right.
If I can share a suggestion with the presidents or others who might be listening, when John broached this topic, we had not made a major investment in esports. We were kind of just dipping our toe in the water. But when John brought that to the conference, we decided to take advantage of the opportunity that exists. So we built a great competition arena. But the one thing that I did, and I wish I could say I did it with great wisdom, but it was actually just chance. Many institutions put their esports like in their club sports. We've actually put it in an academic college.
Okay.
And as a result, what happened is our faculty, department chairs, and deans embraced it. So yes, we've got dozens of students who compete for our esport teams. We have multiples, we have hundreds who are actually now taking academic programs related to the sports of esports, to the business administration. When you think about sport administration, they're in game development, they're in business. And so it's actually embedded in our academic enterprise, and we compete at a very high level. But as I say, we've probably got a couple hundred students who are participating in academic programs around the business of esports.
Jeff, you also have one of the finest sports media programs in the country.
Yes, we do. We'd like to say we're number one.
Yes, I got to know Chris Taylor a few years ago, and he's done a remarkable job. So kudos to you for that as well, because that's advanced thinking as well.
And I'm great. Chris does a great job, and the investment we've made in those facilities. And what I'm so proud of is, it started in the same way sports broadcasting was about broadcasting events. And what our program does so well is the storytelling.
Yes.
And so if people want to go on YouTube and do a search, they can see some of the programs that our students have produced that really are of ESPN 30 for 30 quality. And so we're turning out students who really understand the future of it's not just about, play by play of a football game or a basketball game, which is part of it, but it's all the storytelling that goes around it.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable. So kudos to you and your team. My last question, and it's probably a broad question, but I think you each have important perspectives. How do you hire ADs in this environment? Usually ADs in the past were good managers of people. They were around, they attended every game, every event, that type of thing. Now, my sense is that more of them need to be out there, external fundraising. So how do you do both? You're supposed to be on campus doing this, but you've got to be off campus doing this. Jeff, why don't you start? How do you manage that with your AD?
Well, so it's not that different from board expectations, how they've evolved for university presidents, or now certainly deans of our academic colleges. The experiences, the skills, the aptitudes have continued to evolve, and so they need to be able to navigate both the culture of an academic institution, but also be committing their time and their energy to engaging, as you say, potential donors, whether it's for facilities or whether it's for scholarships. And so when we're going through an interview process, I want to see the leadership development profile of the potential candidates and have detailed conversations about their experience engaging external constituents and their understanding about how they're going to manage their time to ensure that they have that time. And then related to it is, in the same way you'll now ask a head football coach of an FBS, tell me about the 10 people you're going to hire to be on your staff, right? Because they're doing less traditional coaching and more, managing a large organization. I want to ask an AD candidate, so what would your leadership team look like? What would you need to support you so you can have the time, to do those external things, and to hear how they would construct their leadership team and go about assessing the existing strength that you have and the deficits that might need to be filled. So it's the changing nature of college administration. It isn't, my father was a professor for 40 years, beginning all the way back in 1958, and he was a faculty athletic rep at the University of Virginia in the early to mid 60s. That world is very different today than it was when my father had that responsibility.
Certainly is. Certainly is. That's great. John, how about you? You interact with ADs all day long, and what kinds of strengths do you see that make them successful?
In my mind, no two ADs are alike. They all bring an array of strengths with them. And for me, the key is that individual then builds a staff around them that augments their strengths and weaknesses. The nuts and bolts things they all have to do. I think one of the most important things an AD will do is hire coaches. That's the people part of it is spot on. You've got to get that right. And coaches make such an incredible difference in what we do. Then they're all involved in the procurement of resources. Now, they're not all great marketers. They're not all great fundraisers. But if that's a talent of them, then they're going to lean into it. If it's not, then they're going to build staff around them that assists them and helps lead that. And then finally, it's important that they very much lean into in the support of the success of their student athletes on the field, in the classroom, socially, all of that. That's what we're there for. And so looking across all of those spectrums and making sure they touch all of that in some way, form, or fashion.
Well, gentlemen, this has been a terrific conversation. I have a feeling that my listeners will get a lot out of it. You've given some good advice, some prescient thoughts on where we're going and how adaptable and flexible leaders have to be. So I want to thank you both for taking time at a crazy busy time of year. So I really do appreciate that.
Well, I enjoyed the conversation, Karen. Thank you. And as you can tell, I feel fortunate that John Steinbrecher is serving as the commissioner of the Mid-American Conference.
Privileged to be with you, Karen.
Thank you.